Well, thank you, Paul, and really a huge thank you to the Conduit team for inviting me to open this really inspiring event. And the energy in the room is really quite palpable. And I think that comes from something Paul already referred to, the fact that we just have such a diversity of talent, of expertise, of profiles, of backgrounds here. And when I was looking at the list of participants and kind of looking down the list, we have people from sport, people from the business world, people from the arts, people working in local authorities and cities, NGOs, the media, refugee-led organizations, think tanks, entrepreneurs, people working in the health sector, financial services, people working in development, in the law. It's just an incredible array of expertise. And I think when we face a challenge as complex and as pressing as people being uprooted from their homes in the way they are today and on the scale they are today, it's very, very clear that the traditional ways of responding to that are simply not enough. And we need creativity, we need your creativity, we need that collaboration that Paul talked about, and we need that vision that can really catalyse change and generate meaningful, sustainable and practical solutions that move beyond the rhetoric and that move beyond the politics around this issue. The approach that the Conduit is pursuing here is very much in line with the Global Compact on Refugees, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But it's very much in that spirit, which is about bringing together multiple stakeholders from across society and really bringing to bear our collective energies and our collective commitment to addressing forced displacement and the challenges facing refugees. I'm going to speak a little bit about the global picture, and I think it goes without saying that the trends, the global trends and the landscape in which we're all operating is extremely stark. I sometimes hesitate to start with the numbers because they can kind of obscure the individual stories of each and every refugee, but I think in this case it is important to talk about numbers, and there's one number that's extremely important because it does tell a story. And that number is 114 million people forcibly displaced around the world today because of conflict, because of climate, because of persecution, because of the other factors that Paul has referred to: climate, inequality, misinformation, hate speech, all those things coming together to generate forced displacement on a scale that we have never seen before, certainly not in many, many decades. It tells a story, that number tells a story of a world that's very fractured. That goes without saying. It's a number that's twice what it was a decade ago. It's 3 times what it was when I joined UNHCR, which is just a bit over 20 years ago. And it really feels as if we're living in a world in which the ability to prevent conflict, to stop conflict, and to make and sustain peace is really ebbing away. And of course, the people who are forced to flee are a very, very visible consequence of that failure. I think at the moment, of course, it feels perhaps even more immediate. In Gaza, clearly, we're witnessing an absolutely unbearable human catastrophe and horrible, horrific loss of life. And that's, of course, a crisis that has ramifications across the region, also beyond the region, even into our own societies. We've just marked the 2nd anniversary this weekend of the start of the war in Ukraine. More than 6 million refugees, many million more displaced inside Ukraine. And of course, what that represents is families torn apart. It represents 6 million lives effectively coming to a halt, homes destroyed. And of course, people left in a situation of limbo with a very uncertain future. There's no obvious sense that a resolution to the situation in Ukraine is on the horizon. Now, these big crises obviously occupy our TV screens, they occupy our thoughts. But what we've seen more and more is that when we have this sort of succession of crises, even major crises slip out of the headlines very quickly, and they really can be obscure. They don't attract the same level of attention. And the one I want to just say a few words about is Sudan, which, last spring we saw, the eruption of this very brutal power struggle. People being displaced, a new stage in a crisis there. 7 million people displaced, placing huge impacts on people's lives, but also placing a strain on the neighbouring countries that have had to receive people from Sudan. And one need only think of Chad, a country that's also struggling with its own challenges. So that's a crisis that has slipped out of the headlines a little bit. And apart from these sort of big, large-scale crises, we also have what are smaller emergencies, but are still pretty major. And UNHCR, in fact, responded to 44 displacement emergencies in 31 countries last year. So that just kind of demonstrates that we're talking about a crisis that it spans all regions. We're talking about new crises. We're talking about old conflicts that reignite, and we're talking about long-standing ones that continue to have people living outside their countries for very long periods of time. And I think a common theme, and this is certainly something that has emerged over the last 10, 15 years, is that we're not seeing a resolution to these crises. So people are living in exile for longer and longer periods, and we only need to think of Syria, a crisis that now has had people living in exile for 12 years now. Very few prospects of being able to return, of being able to look forward to a solution. So when we talk about displacement, it's not a temporary state, unfortunately, for many people. And for most, it's the beginning of a long-term state of affairs. Paul has already talked about the fact that we often see the refugee crisis as something that has a particular impact and resonance in Europe, in North America, whereas in fact the impact of refugee crises and displacement is very much in the developing world. It's in low and middle income countries. Typically, refugees and displaced people do stay close to home. So of that figure that I mentioned, 114 million, 2/3 remain inside their own countries, internally displaced. Only around 1/3 are actually crossing borders. And when they do cross borders, they're in general staying in countries neighbouring their own. So typically 69% of refugees stay in countries next door to their own. And more than 3/4 of all refugees are in low or middle income countries, where of course resources are already very, very scarce. Now, typically what we see is that those countries in general do keep their borders open, do welcome refugees, and typically it's host communities, often in the border areas, that are receiving refugees and that are very much the first responders in refugee crises. And we do see incredible generosity from the large refugee hosting countries and the communities and local people who receive them. But inevitably, that generosity is tested over time. And we do see pressure on resources, on services. Bigger trends have an impact on the ability of host countries to continue to receive and support people. So when we have food insecurity, the impact of climate, the impact of the war in Ukraine and what that did to supply chains, it places a strain on refugees and their hosts, and that becomes very, very evident. And the consequences are that we see that hospitality starting to wane. We sometimes see pressure for refugee returns in circumstances that are less than voluntary and are certainly not safe. And we also see, and Paul has referred to this, we see refugees being forced into situations where they have to make very, very difficult choices. So do they stay where they are in a situation that's becoming more and more difficult? Do they return home, often in very difficult circumstances? Or do they move on in search of more stability and a safer and more secure future? So those are incredibly difficult choices. So what does that mean? It absolutely means that countries further away have to stand up. Those countries that are less impacted need to step up in solidarity with those countries and the communities that are most affected, and really show that they are prepared to share responsibility in very concrete, tangible ways. And that includes by receiving refugees themselves. But it also means looking for, I think, new ways of engaging with and responding to refugee crises. The Global Compact on Refugees was adopted by the General Assembly in 2018, and it was an attempt to reframe and rethink how we engage as a global community with forced displacement and with refugee crises. So it was a UN compact. It was adopted by the General Assembly in 2018, and what it tried to do was take this principle of international cooperation, shared responsibility for refugees, and that's very much at the heart of the Refugee Convention. So it was trying to take that principle and really translate it into something very concrete, really give it substance. It was built around 4 pillars. It is built around 4 pillars. The first pillar is easing that pressure on host communities, and in particular, reframing how we engage with refugee crises in terms of development, the need for a development response, not purely a humanitarian response. And that's particularly important when we look at how refugee crises become protracted. There was a focus on refugee self-reliance, so not simply abandoning refugees, leaving them on the margins, but emphasizing jobs, education, connectivity, and including them in the societies where they find themselves. The third pillar is access to third country solutions, and this is an area that has really gathered momentum, I think, over the last few years. So not only expanding refugee resettlement, but looking at other pathways for refugees to move on safely and securely to third countries. So whether that's through labour mobility pathways, scholarships to universities, family reunion, other pathways. So that has really gathered some momentum, and I know a number of you in this room have been very much involved in driving that agenda forward over the last few years. Supporting conditions in countries of origin, so looking forward to solutions and the conditions that can make it possible for people to overcome displacement and finally rebuild their lives back home. So those were essentially the 4 pillars. Now, what was striking, I think, looking back at that Global Compact, was first of all the emphasis on the potential of refugees. And this goes back again to what Paul was saying, that if the right investments are made, if you place refugees at the centre of the response and the centre of your solutions, if you help them build the capacities to shape their own lives, that can be absolutely transformative. And then the emphasis that I've already mentioned about including refugees in local economies and services, and really helping them participate and contribute. So not leaving refugees sitting in camps, for years on end with sort of parallel services and leaving them as recipients of assistance, but really that emphasis on including them in local communities and the benefits that brings to to everybody. And then the third thing that was really important, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, was this multi-stakeholder approach. So no longer are refugees and refugee crises something to be dealt with by aid agencies and UN agencies and host countries and donor countries, but they need that wider engagement, and that multi-stakeholder approach was really important. Last December, we had the second Global Refugee Forum. This was held in Geneva over 3 days in December, and that was something that was envisaged in the Global Compact on refugees. It was quite, I think, a really transformative moment. I think one of the purpose really was to take stock. What have we achieved? Are we managing to deliver on these pillars that we've set out in this compact? And it, I think there was an amazing energy, and there was a sense that there are solutions out there. We are pursuing them, and there's so much more potential in what we can do. It felt like a really transformative moment. And I think one of the things that was quite transformative was the fact that there were so many refugees there. We had over 300 refugees participating in the Global Refugee Forum, and they were everywhere. They were speaking at every event. They had been very heavily involved in the preparations for the forum, acting as expert advisors for governments. Many refugee-led organisations had really been working to build towards the forum. So it felt very exciting. It felt like a very important moment. And I know that for me and for other colleagues who've been working with refugees for a long time, it felt like something had changed. And I think to be able to take that spirit and really move it forward is now it's got to be an absolute priority. Wide range of actors there. I've already talked about this multi-stakeholder approach. We had more than 1,600 pledges. And when I talk about pledges, I'm not just talking about financial pledges across a whole range of areas. So in refugee education, mental health, connectivity, digital transformation, including refugees in national statistics systems. A lot of focus on economic inclusion. I know that's something you'll be really exploring over the next day and a half. So how do we help refugees access job opportunities? How do we help them get access to financial products, to microfinance, to the skills and the backing that they need in order to fulfill their potential? A lot of emphasis on third country solutions, addressing hate speech, misinformation, sports, regional pledges in relation to specific refugee situations. Private sector very present, so that role of companies, that role of foundations was very evident across the 3 days in Geneva. As I said, not just about funding, but really about investing in refugee hosting areas, providing direct support to refugee entrepreneurs, scholarships, and other kinds of investments. So today and tomorrow, I think the conversations that you're going to be having are very much in line with that spirit of expanding the way we think and engage, the way we think about and the way we engage with refugee crises and with refugees. And I think the kinds of solutions that you're going to be talking about, including the solutions that will be discussed and put forward and for your consideration, they're very much in the spirit of this new multilateralism, which is all about unlocking potential. So, yeah, the program you have, I think, is really exciting and very much in line with that spirit. And I think what we're really looking at and what you will be talking about in this context is if we don't invest in refugees, if we leave them on the margins, if we abandon them, if we leave them unskilled or uneducated, it is a huge missed opportunity. And it's not only in the interests of refugees, it's in our interests as a global community to help refugees, give them the possibility to carve out a more prosperous and secure future and to triumph over the trauma and the tragedy of forced displacement. And I think if we look at forced displacement, we look at the experiences of refugees, and just to go back to what I was saying at the beginning, those experiences are very much a product of divisions and fractures. And I would say that we owe it to refugees to do something differently. We owe it to them to have them see us coming together in a spirit of unity, embracing solidarity and embracing practical solutions that will allow them to rebuild their lives. So I wish you well over the next couple of days, and I'm really looking forward to being part of the conversations. Thank you.